Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen for, well, the last day of Jane Austen July. Then we will be on our own. We will be doing without the redoubtable mainstays of Jane Austen July, but we will persevere with Pride and Prejudice. And in our most recent chapters, things have not been going well for the Bennet girls, the two oldest Bennet girls. The middle Bennet girl, Mary, the bookworm, well, things seem to go fine for her. Or at least if they don't go fine for her, she's not aware of it. And the two younger girls, well, they're mainly boy mad for bright officer uniforms. So we're talking mainly about Elizabeth and Jane. Things have not been going well for Elizabeth and Jane. Elizabeth had a lot of her predispositions about Mr. Darcy checked at the Netherfield ball. Two different people approached her saying, or upbraided her saying, you know, your decision to decide that Darcy is the villain and Mr. Wickham is the hero is probably wrong. And she didn't like that. But she sailed on, confident that her original ideas were correct. But then her day got worse because oily, obsequious Mr. Collins proposed to her. And at first, maddeningly, refused to acknowledge that her refusal was a refusal. He thought that's just the way that women are. They just turn you down. Her refusal was not just a gesture. She was serious about it, which outraged her mother. And let's keep in mind, her mother is not wrong about that. Elizabeth is not going to have any money. She's not going to have any way to support herself and no way to live. Nowhere to live when her father dies. She will be booted out of Longbourn. So finding a husband with a household and an income is imperative. She doesn't seem to realize that. She doesn't seem to care. But the proposition is uncomfortable for her. She turns him down and then manages to get back her good spirits. But no sooner has she done that than her sister Jane gets a devastating letter from Netherfield Hall informing her that the whole party that was there, including Mr. Bingley, who she's clearly in love with and who's clearly in love with her, have decamped to London. They're gone, and they're not coming back this winter. They're not coming back for the whole of the season. Elizabeth does her best to tell her sister that this is not the end of the world, that this is the letter that you got on the subject from one of Mr. Bingley's sisters, is clearly shaving the truth, and that you don't need to worry about it. You saw the way he looked at you. We all saw the way you looked at him. You don't need to worry about it. But you get the feeling that Jane still does worry about it, and certainly she's desolate that her friends, the Bingley women, and also her special friend, Mr. Bingley, will not be around all winter long. That would be depressing anyway, even if she weren't uncertain about the future. And the whole of the Bennet family also has a little bit of bad news, which is that despite the fact that Mr. Collins has been rejected now by Elizabeth, and despite the fact that Mrs. Bennet has rejected him on behalf of Jane, and despite the fact that he's looking very abraded and wounded about that fact, he doesn't shorten his visit. He's still sticking around until Saturday. So now we come to chapter 22. And believe it or not, things get worse. So let's see what we have here. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases. The Lucases are a nearby family, very nearby. They're very close with the Bennet family. Members come and go all the time. Charlotte Lucas is the daughter of the household and is a special friend of Elizabeth Bennet, her best friend other than her sister Jane. And again, during the chief of the day, was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins doesn't really know who to talk to in the Bennet family. He's clearly not liked by Mr. Bennet, so that was a failure. He's very much liked by Mrs. Bennet, but there's nothing she can do to help him. She can't make Elizabeth marry him. Elizabeth doesn't want to marry him and is trying to be friendly with him, but he won't even look at her. So he doesn't quite know what to do. And when that first happened, Charlotte Lucas happened to stop by the household and was happy to listen to him. And now we're told that it happens again. That the Lucases dine with the Bennets, and once again, Charlotte Lucas is right there to lend a sympathetic ear to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. "It keeps him in good humor," said she, "and I am more obliged to you than I can express." Charlotte assured her friend of her satisfaction in being useful, and that it amply repaid her for the little sacrifice of her time. This was very amiable, but Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing less than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins' addresses by engaging them towards herself. So Charlotte Lucas has an aim in mind. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favorable that when they parted at night, she would have felt almost sure of success if he had not been to leave for Hertfordshire so very soon. But here she did injustice to the fire and independence of his character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable slyness, and hasten to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. He was anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, and he was not willing to have the attempt known till its success could be known likewise. For though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventure of Wednesday, when he was shot down. His reception, however, was the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked toward the house, and instantly set out to meet him, accidentally, in the lane. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. In a short time, as Mr. Collins' long speech would allow, everything was settled between them to the satisfaction of both, and as they entered the house, he earnestly entreated her to name the day that was to make him the happiest of men. And though such a solicitation might be waived for the present, the lady felt no inclination to trifle with his happiness. The stupidity with which he was favored by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that could make a woman wish for its continuance. Jane Austen has such an incredible way with words. Let's read that sentence again. She's happy that he proposed, but she can't stand how dumb he is and wants the courtship to be over as soon as possible. The stupidity with which he was favored by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that could make a woman wish for its continuance. And Miss Lucas, who accepted him solely for the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment. Oh, Charlotte, I know you have a feckless and extremely superficial father, but that's no reason to sign your life away. Or maybe not. Miss Bennet would certainly say it is, as we're going to see. She cared not how soon that establishment were gained. Sir William and Lady Lucas were speedily applied to for their consent, and it was bestowed with a most joyful alacrity. Mr. Collins's present circumstances made it a most eligible match for their daughter, to whom they could give little fortune, and his prospects of future wealth were exceedingly fair. Lady Lucas began directly to calculate with more interest than the matter had ever excited before how many years longer Mr. Bennet was likely to live, because Mr. Collins gets Longbourn. And Sir William gave it as his decided opinion that whenever Mr. Collins should be in possession of Longbourn estate, it would be highly expedient that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James's. The whole family, in short, were properly overjoyed on the occasion. The younger girls formed hopes of coming out a year or two sooner than might otherwise have done. The boys were relieved from their apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. She had gained her point, and had time to consider of it. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. But still he would be her husband. Without thinking highly of either men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honorable provision for a well-educated young woman of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservation from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. The least agreeable circumstance in the business was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. I know this is written with supreme elegance, but this is incredibly bleak stuff. Incredibly. Charlotte is 27. She's very close to having no other possibilities. No one's going to come wooing a 30-year-old woman in the countryside with no fortune, no property, no expectations of anything. No one's going to do that. And she knows it. And she has no affection for men, no affection for matrimony, certainly no affection for Mr. Collins. She agrees anyway. Elizabeth would wonder, and probably would blame her, and though her resolution was not to be shaken, her feelings must be hurt by such disapprobation. She resolved to give her the information herself, and therefore charged Mr. Collins, when he returned to Longbourn to dinner, to drop no hint of what had passed before any of the family. A promise of secrecy was of course very dutifully given, but it could not be kept without difficulty, for the curiosity excited by his long absence burst forth in such very direct questions on his return as required some ingenuity to evade. and he was at the same time exercising great self-denial, for he was longing to publish his prosperous love. I understand Charlotte putting this mission on him, but honestly, I don't know how Mr. Collins does this. He's so transparent and so incapable of self-control. I don't know how I think he actually does do this, but I don't, because Elizabeth is surprised when she learns. But I don't know how he does it, with everyone flocking all around him, wondering where he's been all day. But anyway, as he was to begin his journey too early on the morrow to see any of the family, the ceremony of leave-taking was performed when the ladies moved for the night, and Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness and cordiality, said how happy they would be to see him at Longbourn again whenever his other engagements might allow him to visit them. "My dear madam," he replied, "this invitation is particularly gratifying, because it is what I have been hoping to receive, and you may be very certain that I shall soon avail myself of it." They were all astonished, and Mr. Bennet, who could by no means wish for so speedy a return, immediately said, "But is there not danger of Lady Catherine's disapprobation here, my good sir? You had better neglect your relations than run the risk of offending your patroness." "My dear sir," replied Mr. Collins, "I am particularly obliged to you for this friendly caution, and you may depend upon my not taking so material a step without her lady's concurrence." "You cannot be too much on your guard. Risk anything rather than her displeasure, and if you find it likely to be raised by your coming to us again, which I should think exceedingly probable, stay quiet at home, and be satisfied we shall take no offense." In other words, don't hurry back. "Believe me, my dear sir, my gratitude is warmly excited by such affectionate attention, and depend on it, you will speedily receive from me a letter of thanks for this, as well as for every other mark of your regard during my stay here. As for my fair cousins, though my absence may not be long enough to render it necessary, I shall now take my liberty of wishing them health and happiness, not excepting my cousin Elizabeth." With proper civilities, the ladies then withdrew, all of them equally surprised to find that he meditated a quick return. Mrs. Bennet wished to understand by it that he thought of paying his address to one of her younger girls, and Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. I think they'd have made a perfect match. Mary wouldn't have considered him revolting. She had rated his abilities much higher than any of the others, and there was a solidity in his reflections which often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that if encouraged to read and improve himself by such example as hers, he might become a very agreeable companion. And I know Jane Austen is being sarcastic here, because she's portrayed both of these people as insufferable, but I think she's right. I think they would have been kindred spirits. I think Mary would have been perfectly happy sucking up to Lady Catherine, and Lady Catherine would have liked how bookish she was. Especially if she could be convinced to maybe ameliorate it a little. I know we're supposed to be laughing here at these two, but still. But on the following morning, every hope of this kind was done away. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast, and in private conference with Elizabeth, related the event of the day before. The possibility of Mr. Collins fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two, but that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as that she could encourage him herself, and her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum. She could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible!" Which is kind of rude to say to your best friend when you get the happy news. Even in the present day, it's kind of rude. If your best friend bustles you upstairs for a private meeting and says, "I just got engaged to so-and-so," and you say, "No way! You've got to be kidding." That's not going to go over well. That's the moment for self-control, and Elizabeth loses it, and to be fair to her, she's ashamed with herself for losing self-control in that moment. The steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to a momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach. Though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure, and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?" But Elizabeth had now recollected herself, and making a strong effort for it, was able to assure her with tolerable firmness that the prospect of their relationship was highly grateful to her, and that she wished her all imaginable happiness. "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connections, and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state. Oh, Charlotte. Oh, oh Charlotte. Elizabeth quietly answered, undoubtedly. Note the genius of that quietly. In the scene, if we're just reading along and Jane Austen is not helping us in any way, we could think that Elizabeth would burst out that undoubtedly. That she's still compensating for her rudeness a minute before and would burst it out enthusiastically. But instead, Jane Austen gives us that quietly because it's mournful. There's no way to make this a happy moment. And no way to hide the fact that neither one of them thinks it is. And after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. It was a long time before she became at all reconciled to the idea of so unsuitable a match. The strangeness of Mr. Collins making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison to his being accepted now. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that when called into action she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture. And to the pang of friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen. And that's the end of chapter 22, and that is absolutely true. There's no chance that Charlotte Lucas is going to be happy, even though the mind frame that she's going into marriage with was very common in the day. It's maybe a little common even today, but despite Charlotte thinking, well, plenty of people start marriage on worse footing than this, it's unlikely that it's going to be better. Those of you who know the book know that it doesn't get any better. We get another glimpse of this, and it's a nightmare. I think it's interesting that in this moment, Elizabeth is so bowled over by her disappointment and grief with her best friend that she isn't even thinking of the other implication, which is that the Lucases will take possession of Longbourn Estate. The chance now, one of the ideas of Mr. Collins for taking one of the Bennet sisters as his wife was to more or less partially keep Longbourn in the Bennet family, to make it at least possible for some of the women to stay there. And now it's going to belong to the Lucas family. It's going to belong to Charlotte Lucas. She's going to be the mistress of Longbourn in due time. Elizabeth isn't even thinking of that. But this is considerable disarray. So Mr. Collins is leaving first thing in the morning. We're not going to see him again for a bit. And Charlotte Lucas is now pledged to be his wife, with the ceremony presumably happening soon. So the illusion in Mrs. Bennet's mind that Elizabeth might be properly married to an amiable young man who not only has a powerful patroness, a good home, and a good income with nominal work, but is also the heir to Longbourn. That's a good match. And Mrs. Bennet, for a while there, was thinking, well, this is certainly going to go to Elizabeth. And for a while, she's thinking that an even better match is going to her eldest daughter, that Jane is going to marry Mr. Bingley, who's extremely wealthy, and maybe won't keep Netherfield Hall, or maybe he will, but it has a house in London, has wealthy connections, that sort of thing. We know, because of the letter that Jane got, that is imperiled. That does not look 100% true. Jane and Elizabeth decide to keep the contents of that letter from Mrs. Bennet, so that all the disappointment they have to worry about from her is just her being disappointed that the Netherfield party has left, because she was liking interacting with them, even though they weren't completely liking interacting with her. But now all that's over. The Netherfield party has left. Netherfield Hall is empty again. And Mr. Collins is leaving first thing in the morning before anybody's up to see him off, with a new wife in tow, and it's not a Bennet girl. So where are we going to go from here? Well, wherever we're going to go from here, we're going to go without Jane Austen in July. I want to doff my frilly bonnet to Jane Austen in July, a great booktube event. I wasn't expecting to do this for Jane Austen in July. I was expecting to do a whole bunch of Jane Austen pastiche fiction, but this has been so much fun. Doing this has been so much fun, and all of you have been so much fun as well about it, teasing me about the fact that I cannot simply read this to you. I have to add interjections, which one of you called annotations, but also liking that fact, which is fine by me, since I obviously cannot stop from doing it. So this is too much fun to stop. I know years ago I did a mandatory read-along of Pride and Prejudice. But doing read aloud, where I read it to you and talk about it with you, too much fun to stop. So even though Jane Austen July has come to the end of another great year, we're going to keep going with Pride and Prejudice. We're going to read. We're going to read right to the end. So in this Penguin edition, this battered old Penguin edition that I've just settled on to do this reading, we are on page 122, and this edition ends on page 400. So we have a long way to go. But there's lots and lots of stuff that's going to happen. Oh my, such conversations we're going to have. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll be back in August. Thank you, Booty.